looking at Europe may be very misleading, thinking, I'm going to do someplace else, a process like in Europe. Maybe it's not desirable, maybe it's not feasible. So you have to be very, very clear what are the conditions that you have, what are the objectives that you have, and where you want to start, where you want to end. And I think there's also a question of with whom you want to do it. With whom you want to do it, at least initially, and maybe then move forward. But maybe it's easier to start with a smaller group, more like-minded group of countries, and then evolve later. Now, I was a student of Bella Balassa, and many people misquote, I would say 99% of people misquote what Balassa said about the 5 levels of integration. We know from free trade area, customs union, a common market, and economic union, and a full integration. And they misquote him because they don't use the term 5 degrees of integration, they use the expression 5 stages of integration. As if one indeed starts with a free trade area and then one moves forward and we will end up with full integration. And this is a bit the European experience in a sense. But I think this is a totally misguided view of the world. And it's totally misguided because I think that we will see in the European case, at least in the EU case, in the EU we started from the beginning saying we want to be a common market. And we are going to start by being a customs union. So we immediately started with a very political objective. And we didn't say, well, we just want to remove barriers to trade and have a trade project here, a free trade area. And then maybe one day everything goes well and we are going to move to the next step. I think that doesn't work that way. And we will see in a second what was the experience of Europe. This was not the way it worked. So very, very important initial discussion is, do you want to be and start as a free trade area, or do you want to start as a customs union? It may look like a trivial, we all know Article 24 of the GATT, and it looks like a trivial. But it's not trivial at all. It's really a very, very important fundamental choice, a purely political choice. Those that have started a free trade area, they have remained free trade area. And to me, there is nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with a well-working free trade area. But if you want to go really for economic integration, deep economic integration, then if you start with a free trade area, you're not going to get there. So you have to know exactly what is it you want out of this, and then decide what is your first step. But I think if your first step is going to be a free trade area, because somehow you don't have the political will to do something else, then it will not prove later that you will be able to do. So you have to choose. But what is clear is that whichever choice you make, do it well. So my message is not that, we all have to go European way, do a customs union. No, it is hard to do a customs union. And that's why we have very, very few customs unions around the world. Because they are very hard to achieve. Because a customs union already implies pooling some sovereignty. It's clear. And that little bit of sovereignty about trade policy and about sharing the tariffs that the customs union involves, it's in fact a huge step. Now, what we see in Europe is that there were clearly 4 very, very important factors for this success of the process of integration. And I want to take you through that. First one is that there was a very ambitious founding vision put forward in the Rome Treaty in 1957. Then we did it gradually. There was gradual elimination of barriers, both internal and external. There were very important common institutions that drove the process. And then also important common policies, including about redistribution. Now, one has to remember that there were, in the 50s, in the 60s, there were 2 visions of European integration. One was the vision of what then became the EU. And the founding treaty was very clear. It put forward a political vision. It said that the countries, they were determined to lay the foundations of an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. This is what the Treaty of Rome says in its preamble. This is a very political statement, right? An ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. Now, if you look at the preamble of the competing grouping, the European Free Trade Area around the UK and other countries, they had a totally different vision. It was a purely economic vision. They said, determined to facilitate the removal of trade barriers and the promotion of closer economic cooperation. It's totally different. 2 totally different projects. To me, both projects very interesting projects, and both actually have been successful projects in different manners. I'm not finding that EFTA is less interesting than the EU. No. It had modest objective, and it achieved its modest objective. I think it's great. No, it's true that many countries, little by little, left EFTA to go into the EU, and that's a different matter. But EFTA did not turn into something different. It's countries that changed their viewpoint. So, gradual elimination of barriers. I'm not going to repeat all that has happened over the years, the customs union, the common market, the single market. Clearly, at the same time also that there was elimination of barriers inside the EU, what is important, there was gradually also removal of external barriers. If you look today, in the sense, what has been the extent of integration that has been achieved, the extent is huge. Okay, as far as goods market is concerned, very high degree of integration. There's total free mobility of goods in the EU. If you look at services market, after 50 years of integration, it's still far from fully integrated. I would say medium. There's still a number of barriers that are there. Labor markets, there is free mobility of labor in Europe, but there is in fact very little integration of labor markets, because labor markets are in the hand of national states. We don't have EU labor market policy. We have national labor market policy. Therefore, labor markets are not integrated. There is not an EU-wide labor market, even though there is mobility of labor. And capital mobility is very high. There is full integration there. And it's very much parallel on what is going on outside. Goods market, we have very low barriers to trade in industrial products. We all know that we have quite a bit higher barriers on agricultural goods. Services, low integration domestically, low integration or medium integration towards the outside. Labor markets, well, there is no EU policy in this area. So migration policy is not an EU-wide, it's a national prerogative still. And capital mobility, yes, we have free capital mobility inside and outside of the Union. Now, what is clearly very, very special about the EU are the common institutions. There is no place in the world, no regional integration project that has institutions like what we have in Europe. And I think what is very special among the institutions in Europe is that we have two categories of institutions. We have, in a sense, federal institutions, and we have member state institutions. You know, we have the Council of Ministers. Okay, the Council of Ministers is a bit like the Senate in the United States. Very, very important. But we have those federal institutions that are driving the process of integration according to the treaty. Countries have signed up to a treaty and they've signed up to do certain things. And those federal institutions, not only the Commission, but also the Parliament, the European Court of Justice, they are there to enforce those commitments on the part of the member states. And it is this dialogue, in a sense, between those federal institutions, the Commission, the Parliament, the Court of Justice, and the member state-driven institution, the Council, where the ministers are sitting, or the heads of state of the countries are sitting. This is this interaction between the two, the federal institution and the member state-driven institution, which is, I think, the really characteristics of the process of integration. So you can't say it's a process driven by the federal institutions at the expense of the other ones, or the other way around. No, it's really this dynamics, this dialogue between the two, sometimes extremely, extremely difficult, extremely painful, and sometimes better, sometimes more difficult, but this is the reality. It's a Europe of people, it's a Europe of citizens, but it's a Europe of member states. And there is Brussels, but there is London, Warsaw, Prague, Athens, and Paris that are there, and each of those capitals play an important role. So, common institutions, common policies. If you think of Musgrave, the Musgravian view of economic policies, allocative policies, redistributive policies, stabilization policies, we have all those policies at the EU level. There are allocation policies, right? Fostering efficiency of resource allocation, competition policy, industrial policy, trade policy. If you look at redistribution, there are redistributive policies. I mean, you could look in a sense as agricultural policy as redistributive policy. It's a redistributive policy, and certainly the regional policy, redistributing money from the richer regions towards the poorer regions, is an important redistributive policy. It's actually almost all of the EU budget. The EU budget is very small, 1% of GDP. 80% of the EU budget is redistributive. You can say it's much too much. Perhaps you could say it's much, much too much. Compared to the EU budget. Maybe the EU budget should go much more to allocative.